We recognise the need to elaborate the understanding of pedagogy, which forwards our reading of public pedagogy. Initially, I wish to make a few very brief remarks to position this reading of pedagogy. The term pedagogy is often left unexplained and unexplored in the literature of public pedagogy. Sandlin, O'Malley and Burdick in 2011, in their persistent efforts to engage and elaborate the field of public pedagogy, urge researchers to be explicit about the theoretical traditions that they are engaging. We concur and we have taken up this call. So I will speak first on pedagogy, and then Karen will talk more on public, and then we will bring these together as our reading of public pedagogy and then the educative agent. Our reading of pedagogy calls upon an understanding of the educative agent as actualised in the public realm. This reading speaks to the larger field of pedagogy beyond its work in public pedagogy. In 2013, Burdick and Sandlin offered 3 strands of readings of pedagogy in the literature on public pedagogy. The first strand posits human subject at the centre. This reading of pedagogy has instruction at its centre as, and I quote, "This strand takes up the notion of pedagogy as consisting of the impartment of forms of knowledge by the intentional, albeit possibly indirect, transferal of content," end quote. This instruction is often intended to be liberatory and resonates in the literature of critical pedagogy. As Giroux has argued, at the heart of this pedagogical reading is the significant role of the public pedagogue, who is in the place of the teacher, and we'll be addressing the public pedagogue most specifically today. The second strand Burdick and Sandlin draw upon is the metaphor of relation, and is evidence, for example, in the post-feminist, post-structuralist work of Ellsworth. Here, the relationship between the subject and object of pedagogy are explored for embodied, sensate and active interactions. This reading of pedagogy involves a shift in authority from the public pedagogue to the subject. The third strand draws on the post-human, and they name this as the monstrous. Here, readings of pedagogy undo the very idea of self. Our own reading of pedagogy, and then public pedagogy, is more closely aligned to that of the second, that is relation, and the third, the post-human strands. A further issue to consider is how much of the work is under the banner of public pedagogy could be more appropriately read as public curriculum. There is considerable overlap between curriculum and pedagogy. The overlap is located most forcefully in the area of knowledge. In our reading of pedagogy, knowledge is dynamic in its interaction with other pedagogical forces. Its role is constitutive. It is important to note that we understand that knowledge, or its articulation in curriculum, does not stand in the place of pedagogy, as it is not necessarily its prime focus. Pedagogy, understood as teaching strategy, is strongly linked to curriculum. In this intersection of pedagogy and curriculum, the focus is on the teacher and what knowledge is taught and how it is taught. We argue a more comprehensive and informed reading of pedagogy, which has a focus on the learner. We do not disagree with the importance of the arguments on public curriculum, and for that matter on school curriculum. However, we wish to make visible again the figure of the learner who is engaging and constituting and reconstituting that knowledge. We are reading pedagogy as a field of study, which includes the large body of work from learning theory, teaching theory, place theory, and knowledge theory. These draw from the fields of psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, sociology, cultural studies, and education. We argue that pedagogy is that field of study of the relationship between learner and knowledge and context. Context being time, space, place, and objects, and then sometimes there's a teacher. This understanding centers on the pedagogical encounter between these elements and seeks the beginning or the newly constituted that may occur within it. Our engagement with pedagogy shares much of the second strand identified by Burdick and Sandlin. in regarding to an embodied reading. There is a large body of work which focuses pedagogy as relational in public pedagogy. Gadzimbas, Fernandez and Natu draw on the pedagogical theorization of Roger Simon, who identifies the relational in pedagogy as an individual's influential encounter with the other. They emphasize the encounter as between teacher and learner, as always intentional on the part of the teacher and structured through hierarchical positionings. They assert, and I quote, "Any definition of pedagogy must begin with the intention of one subject to influence the life of another, to push against, in a manner of speaking, another's subjectivity." We share their emphasis on the relational, but we diverge from their definition, as we see the pedagogical encounter as being initially learner, knowledge, and place. A teacher may not be present. The encounter may not be intentional, even with the teacher. The singular emphasis on the teacher negates the agency of the learner. Not only that, it fails to acknowledge that there is no direct causal and certain relationship between learning and teaching, in our opinion. To limit the view of the relational nature of learning to the relation between teacher and learner is to negate the importance and the agency of knowledge and of place, and the agency and nature of the learner. The word pedagogy may well have its roots in Pedagogies, with its emphasis on teacher, but pedagogy now is a field of study which centres on the learner. Pedagogy does still address the teacher, but the focus needs to shift to the learner because the learner is the constant in the encounter. Our reading of that encounter between knowledge and place and learner is initially informed by Aoki, Britzman, Green and Van Manen. Pedagogy is, as Van Manen asserted in 1991, and I quote, "cemented deep in the nature of the relationship between self and other." Aoki and Ellsworth urge us to go beyond commonplace understandings of the relationship between those in a learning encounter. Aoki urges attention to the space between. For him, living pedagogy is located in an in-between space, between bodies, between discourses, between the planned and unplanned, between absence and presence. For Ellsworth, it is an ethological reading of the rickety space between self and other. Ellsworth, in 1997, in identifying the place of the unconscious in the pedagogical relationship, articulates the role of, and I quote, "asides, stand-ins, substitutions, denials, forgettings, prohibitions, feelings of fear, shame, pleasure. These involuntary, intuitive and affective responses to the unknown are the spectres or phantasmic traces of pedagogical encounters. In our reading, this relationship always involves the learner and knowledge."
Mary, can I just interrupt you there before you move on? Jennifer's asking about the author that you were just speaking about. I think it was Ellsworth. Is that the one, Jennifer, that you were?
Ellsworth, yeah, sorry. If my language, I'm sorry, I'm not very clear.
Ellsworth?
ELLS.
Yes, it's Ellsworth, 1997. Yeah. I can put up references. Happy.
Oh, the one before Ellsworth, speaking about spaces.
Oh.
Okay. So
The spaces between was Aoki.
and that's AOKI.
Yeah, Ted Aoki, AOKI.
Sometimes, so the relationship always involves a learner and knowledge, but sometimes this learner is a place or it's an environment. Sometimes the place or the context may hold the knowledge. The relationship may not involve another in the role of teacher or what is commonly called a pedagogue. The learner is the one that learns. The learner is often named in the education discourse as the student. In public pedagogy, it may be a member of the public. It may be, for example, an audience member. I would argue it may be a place. It may be that the knowledge or the place or the environment learns. It may be that the teacher learns. The teacher may not be human. It may be the knowledge itself, or it may be that the land or the place or objects teach. Knowledge is a dynamic element in the pedagogical encounter. It speaks to the learner. It is reconfigured and reconstituted by the learning. It is not an inert, stable object. Knowledge is a creation and a creative process. Knowledge is a performance of the world, and in that performance, knowledge exceeds the performance. Place environment is a dynamic element as part of the learning encounter. Place encompasses a reading of the social and cultural world of that encounter. It also includes the physical sites of learning, the objects, buildings, and land of learning. Indigenous writers such as Yonka Porter write about this learning from land. Attention to place pedagogy has been extended now to include the material place surrounding or holding the encounter. We understand this pedagogical relationship is activated as a learning event by the interactions of these components. The learner and the teacher collapse in the public as they become an educative agent. And we'll speak more on that more fully as we attend to this public. In our reading of the pedagogical encounter, the learning which may occur is productive as it constitutes a rupture of what and who the learner has been. The encounter may not even be recognised as an event of learning when it occurs. It is a rupture of who we have been, and a new who we are is revealed. The flow of knowing and understanding and knowledge slip through learner, knowledge, place, and sometimes teacher. Bodies of teacher, learner, knowledge, learning objects, and learning spaces inhabit this encounter. As well, there are the bodies, objects, and spaces summoned and unsummoned from learner, teacher, knowledge, pasts, and future. This place is densely populated with bodies that are enfolded in each other. These bodies, human and not human, are in a dynamic relationship. The certainty of the learning, however, is not apparent. The bodies interact in this learning event. Individuals emerge through this relationship. The learner, the one, is becoming pedagogical. Their histories, desires, wants, fears are amassed, spoken and unspoken. The learner creates the knowledge, and at the same time, the knowledge creates the learner. Spaces and objects interact with learner and knowledge, all vibrant in this process of becoming. This is congruent with Arendt's notion of the agent revealed in speech and action, where there may be no material outcome. They are real, but their reality is not material. Learning is a reality which is not essential or unified, nor reducible to material reality, and nor is it located in specific time or action. Luxon seeks to bring the relational to the fore. In both her exploration of Freud and Foucault, she foregrounds the constitution of our relationship with authority and the mechanisms through which these relationships can be thought and ultimately transformed. And we'll talk more on authority. Karen will explain that at greater length soon. This pedagogical encounter involves new dynamics when in the public realm. Here, the educative agent is the one who speaks or acts with authority in the public. Okay. So from our position on pedagogy, we now turn to how we are theorising and understanding public. Karen will be engaging that.
So we're very interested in manifestations of the public that occur often but go unrecognised. But in order to understand what this notion of the public might mean, we draw on the work of Hannah Arendt, because in Hannah Arendt's work we find the possibilities of what we can think of as agency in what she terms and what we term the public realm. And there's lots of different theorizations of what is this thing we call the public. We don't have the time really to explore all of the others fulsomely, but if you buy our book next year, you'll see that we do that. But in this instance, we're staying with Where We Settled, which is the work of Hannah Arendt. So Arendt's work in the human condition. So we, we're encouraging people to have a look at the introduction to this book we centered around, is an interrogation on what constitutes being human, both a political and a philosophical expose. This work traverses antiquity through to the modern era. In Arendt's writing on the public and private realm, she identifies two elements of the public. Firstly, Arendt notes, everything that appears in the public can be seen and heard by everybody and has the widest possible publicity. Secondly, she writes, the term public signifies the world itself insofar as it is common to all of us. Arendt describes the split between the public and the private realm as being demarcated by economics that has increasingly moved from what constituted only the affairs of the household in Athenian times into the social in modern times. Arendt notes the private and public realms have been in existence since the rise of the city-state. And this is in contrast to the social realm that Arendt argues is neither private or public and is a relatively new phenomenon. The social is often conflated with the public realm, but for Arendt, the social is a reflection of private interests. Arendt writes that, quote, private interests assume a public significance that we call society. Arendt argues in the shift from public to social with a simultaneous rise of economics as no longer merely a private concern, the public realm has become diminished. Arendt outlines three spheres. Just need to turn to my slide. Of what she describes as being. They are labour, work and action, and these circulate within the society in which we find ourselves. So labour is an activity that is undertaken to preserve ourselves and is biologically driven. Work is the activity that moves human existence outside of the so-called natural world to one where human existence is bounded by that which is not natural. And action is an order of being whereby a new beginning occurs. And this distinction of action is central to our reading of public pedagogy. And of course, we're not alone in this. If anyone's familiar with Biesta's work and other writers on, public pedagogy, such as Jennifer Sandland and Jake Burdick, a lot of people take up this notion of Arendt in one way or another relative to what might be considered, the public realm, and how public pedagogy is a form of action where a new beginning is, where it's possible for a new beginning to occur. Okay, so what we want to do at this point is we're wanting to get you into breakout rooms, and part of what we're trying to tease out, in our book and, in our thinking is where people are positioned when they speak and act. So in this part of the seminar, we're interested in you thinking about how does someone speak from the position of an institution or a discipline. Now, that might be you. You might often speak from that position, or you might have observed someone who does speak from that position. Okay, so, and the kind of affordances that is offered through speaking and acting from within, inside an institution, and read institution in the broadest sense of the word. So yes, of course, it might be the obvious, a university or a more formal educational space. It might be a community education positioning, which is also in its own way a formal educational space. Mm-hmm. It may be, the connection of an artist working within the institution of a gallery. That's another institutional space. And the kind of affordances that occur through being positioned as such.
We are calling this when we are acting as public pedagogue from the institution or the discipline. And so we invite you in your breakout groups, and we hope that there'll be about groups of 6, I think. I can't remember how many people are here. Oh, okay. First of all, for 15 minutes. First of all, we would like someone to make notes in the chat, in the groups. So if someone could offer to do that. And if you could introduce yourself to the group and say what brings you here to the PPI seminar series. What is it in your life that brings you here? And then could you recount, as Karen has said, an instance of when you have either spoken or acted from your institution or discipline, that is, as that professional, public pedagogue, sorry. And maybe a couple of people in the group who might choose, I won't do that. Instead, I will tell you about when I have been witness to some other event of a public pedagogue speaking or acting today in my life. Not in this not referring to this seminar group.
It's a reflection on positioning, right? Okay. So a reflection on positioning of being positioned as a public pedagogue, but speaking through an institutional space or a discipline.
So recounting an instance of when you have spoken as
or acted, yeah,
or acted as a public pedagogue from your institutional authority.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of it? Okay.
Yep, sounds great.
Yeah, I think everybody's back now.
Okay, great. All right, so can I get some feedback from whoever was a designated report back type person as to the sorts of things you spoke about in your group? I'm open to anyone who wants to go first.
I'm happy to go.
Great, thank you, Bindi.
So we had Helen, Community Development Officer, and Ashley from Arizona, working in schools, and Amelia, ASU, and also worked in art galleries. Miriam at Vic Uni and doing her PhD, and Brett from Arizona, who's done teaching around the world. And I've got Helen, Helen's there. So, you know, Ashley, we were talking about this idea of feeling underwater, and, you know, like this idea that, you know, wanting to turn mirrors into windows because we're in this space of trying to have a counter narrative to the branding of the institution that represents particular types of values that aren't actually there to, in the case of, say, unis or schools, to actually support the workplace environment and the bodies of those that came in with the original intention around equity and activism. And so whilst, you know, we didn't want to get too in the, you know, feeling too gloomy, we kind of still maintain the rage in activism around equity, despite this tension on values and the ways in which the institution constructs a very neoliberal branding of creativity and success and culture. So we talked about that, and yeah, broadly around those tensions, and yeah.
Great.
I think I kind of broadly
Thank you.
really struck over everyone's, I hope.
It would have been exciting.
That sounds like a really interesting discussion. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Bindi. Somebody else?
I can go next. Oh, go ahead. Go for it.
Kelly.
Sure, yeah. So I was in a great group with Ron and Grace and Chantel and Caroline, and we spoke about really existing in this really sort of awkward was a word that we used, awkward in-between space when, because most of us found ourselves sort of advocating or bringing in the voice of other people or other people's experience within and around institutions, even though we ourselves didn't feel like we were quote unquote experts or had enough knowledge or authority. But we did act as this like in-between conduit between people being served or sort of supported in some way and the institutions in which they sort of held the resources and knowledge and authority to do something about it. And just the awkwardness of that feeling of sort of being a person to advocate, but without sort of feeling like maybe we belong or an expert to do so.
Okay, that's great, because part of what we are going to pick up on is, you know, how institutions actually use power to structure, you know, or construct whether or not you do feel any sense of authority. So yeah, that was really good, Kelly. Thank you. Another group?
I can go. So in our group, we had Legia, Eo, Professor Sandlin, and I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong, Shaylin,
Yeah.
Shaylin, okay. So kind of our overall interests were just kind of like a fascination with how people learn and learning by accident, and what creates these moments and how we can harness that. And then a little bit more about learning just like in your everyday life, and through like popular culture. And then like taking that, these tools and possibilities of public pedagogy to create impact for people. And I think we kind of talked a little bit about some of the same tensions that y'all are mentioning a little bit, but within that space, we talked about how the tension between like speaking for yourself and your own beliefs as a public pedagogue, but also on behalf of a university, and how sometimes those don't align.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sometimes say things that go against or are counter to what our institution, I guess, believes or says. And then just kind of generally like, who says that we have the authority to do that? Like, why do we have the right to speak on behalf of the institution? And why am I the person that is supposed to be the knowledgeable on this? And then just kind of generally that feeling of like, feeling that tension and being a little bit trapped in between, like, should I say what I truly feel and believe, or should I say what the institution wants me to say?
Nice.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Somebody else?
So we had Liesl, Ryan, Jake, David, David Day, and Boyu in our group. And myself. So we spoke about Liesl. Has been involved in, is an artist and doing artwork in public spaces. So she talked about that interesting experience of being in a public space. One instance was in Flagstaff Station in Melbourne, which is sort of there's a lot of lawyers. It's in the inner city and it's sort of the legal district there. And being for 3 weeks in that space doing artwork and seeing the change over 3 weeks of the first week, people were quite suspicious, uncertain of how to react to these artists and what are they doing. The second week, a bit more comfortable with them being there, and by the third week, starting to interact and engage and ask questions. And so that felt like an interesting position to be in a public space. And she was talking about reflecting on that sort of social positioning in, I think, just sort of being there in those spaces is something that is complex and can be theorized and constitutes research in its own way, I believe. Ryan spoke about doing exhibitions in Science Week type exhibitions that where the assumption was that they would be sharing knowledge sort of outwards, but being attended quite often by homeschooling students and parents who are almost equally interested in sharing their knowledge back to him, so which he hadn't expected. So there was much more two-way exchange in an interesting way that he found and reflected on. Jake mentioned experiences in punk rock venues in days of his youth, I think, where there were loud, angry debates and where there was a space to actually have those debates in particular ways, and where he started to interact with pieces of equity discourse and arguments, public sort of engagement with arguments. Boyu is a grad student. We didn't get our timing great, so he didn't have a chance to share, neither did David, sorry. I spoke briefly about, I spoke about my own sort of ongoing, I guess, identity crisis in terms of feeling a little bit, I guess, that sort of, at what point do you feel like you have the authority to talk from a discipline or from an institution? In various ways I've done that, but I remember marveling at my master's supervisor who would say, well, what we know is, and I always wondered, who's this we? How can she so confidently say we? And it was clear she meant, you know, the academy, us academics, or this knowledge project that we're all involved in. But I sort of thought, how can you ever get enough confidence that you're across all the disciplinary knowledge to position yourself like that? I didn't mind it. I'm perpetually sort of jealous and suspicious of it at the same. Like, I envy the authority, and I like, you know, what it can do. But I also I reflected also that I tend to often give sources of where I found things almost chronically too much, because I don't want to, I want people to have to not think that I'm just saying these things. I want people to know that this is as far as I've got in my own research, and this is where it's coming from, and I'm grappling with this myself. So yeah, something along those lines.
Thank you. That's great, Teo. Thank you. It sounds like it was a very interesting group. Well, they all sound interesting, but you can't be in every group. Or is anyone else wanting to talk or summarise what they spoke about? Anything else that anyone else wants to add? We haven't been through all the groups, but you know, I'm resisting. Yesterday I was in teacher mode, and today I'm in seminar mode. So I'm not going to make anyone talk. So not that I do that anyway. But
I can talk for our group. I think we were group 4 with I was with Kevin and with Peter. We didn't actually disclose the institutions we came from, but we all talked about education settings, and we talked about the challenges of the hierarchical nature of educational institutions, and how often that places you in a bind where no matter how facilitative you might try to be within the classroom, that there's often an expectation from learners that you are the authority figure, and that you are the font of all knowledge. And so we talked a lot about how you might approach breaking down those kinds of structures and stereotypes around what it means to be the authority figure, the pedagogue, and what it means to be the learner.
Nice, good. That's great. Okay, thanks, Jenny. Anyone else?
I'll have a brief go with our group. Oh,
Yeah.
well, Kevin?
I spoke about how when I go into the classrooms as a person with lived experience, I try and let my students know that that they have lived experiences is just as important, and I always ask them to challenge anything I teach. And Jenny asked me, well, how much time does it take to get them to that level? And it's not time, but the energy. It's like pushing out emotional energy so that I know I have a good class when I'm thoroughly exhausted. And I'm always giving unconditional positive regards towards my students. And I try and get them to understand that I'm a student too. And we were asking, well, so how do we do that? And then I just thought about the lecture, and I said, well, if I could tap into the energy and the knowledge in the room, I would not be exhausted, and I could find that energy to keep going that we spoke about earlier, the knowledge and the energy that's of the place where we teach. And if I could tap into that, then I wouldn't be exhausted and I would have constant recharging. And I thought about how I spoke about maybe I'm a teacher until I step in the room, and then I become a facilitator of knowledge in the room. And if I could keep that mindset and not think of myself as a teacher once I cross that threshold, I may be able to do a better job of that. It won't be easy, but that might be a better way of trying to approach learning in the classrooms that I stepped into.
This has been a fantastic discussion. Jen, did you want to add anything?
Oh, just briefly, because we didn't nominate a person, but so the others, Julie and Terry and Elma and Erin, if I miss anything, please jump in. But I really picked up on your phrase, Karen, reflection on positioning, and I think our group, related things that are present in the institutional space and also absent, but also how to make the absent present. I think it was Terry talked about coming to Public Pedagogies Institute and with the presence of art methodologies in the research has found that really enlivening because it's not always present. And Erin was talking about the absence of acknowledging COVID in the United States, and that's sort of how that sort of filtered in her educational or pedagogical encounters and the problematics of that. In my field where I've taught outdoor education or being in the outdoors, I reflected on my institutional space as being in the outdoors and the problematic male hegemony that exists, and how I've positioned myself as a female in that, as the teacher that tries to decenter from the group rather than the hero's journey type of position. So the space in between, I think, really resonated with me and others in our group. Definitely.
Thanks, Jen. I think it's interesting, isn't it? So there is a complexity, if you like, relative to the affordances of being within an institution and speaking from that institutional place, and also the affordances of speaking from a discipline. But there's also always the anxiety that surrounds that, about whether or not you've got to a point where you feel that sense of authority, whether you can step into that mode of being and be that person. And I think it's a constantly negotiated space, but also picking up on the points that people have talked about, when you're acutely aware that you are actually speaking from an institutional positioning, and it's not actually you, it's not actually reflective of the values or your educational philosophy or whatever ways that you want to describe it. But yet part of the gig, for want of a better word, is that it's incumbent upon you to continue to speak from that position, and that has its own challenges. So this is a really good segue, I guess, into the next bit that we're wanting to talk about. So going back to Arendt argues that basically the public realm, if the public realm has receded and has been replaced by the social, the possibility of action is diminished. And this is because if the social is determined by private interests, it consists of elements that cannot be freed from those determinants that occur in work. So work is the production of objects beyond the labour of biological survival. Both labour and work are necessary for existence. Action, however, is a space where freedom can appear. In contemporary times, the blurred boundaries between public and private, through the advent of the social, make it difficult to recognise what might constitute a distinct public realm. And I think, given what we've just spoken about, despite the fact that we might work or be positioned institutionally in spaces that are referred to as public institutions, we are in fact not free. We're not free to speak, and it's not really a public realm as Arendt understands that space. So, and it's only this particular configuration of the public realm where we can realise a third space, that of action and speech. So these manifestations of action and speech, she talks about two occurrences. One is the interest that lies between people and as such binds them together. This is in between words and deeds are about some worldly objective reality in addition to being a disclosure of the acting and speaking subject. In this instance, the outcomes can be quite tangible. So, for example, this could be when people come together for any common purpose, such as to organise a community event or undertake a working bee. The second manifestation of action and speech, according to Arendt, is not tangible, as in are no tangible objects into which it could solidify. However, the second manifestation, like the first, reveals the who through speech and action, and the setting of a new beginning through action, always fall into an already existing web where their immediate consequences can be felt. So categories that mark identity as a role, such as student, teacher, philosopher, or economist, all indicate the what of a person and bring with them the assumptions of particular attributes and qualities. However, in Arendt's work, something other is revealed through the speaking agent. And what this something is difficult to define. In fact, Arendt doesn't definitively state what the characteristics of the who that is revealed could be constituted of, as it's impossible to predict, because for Arendt, the who that is revealed speaks to the uniqueness of each of us. What Arendt does indicate is this revelation is the moment of a beginning and makes itself visible in the public realm. She writes, from which everything merely necessary or useful is strictly excluded. In this public realm, there is the possibility of the appearance of the agent revealed through speech and action. Arendt writes, quote, whenever people gather together, it is potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily and not forever. In this second iteration, there is no capacity to predict or control what might arise through the action and speech of the agent, and as such, we can't attribute the result to the person who set the idea in motion. So this conceptual framing that separates the who and what is significant because it offers relief from the interpolation of the subject into the often detrimental forces of categorisation. So categorisation, it's almost like as humans, we can't help ourselves. We're continually putting things, people, places, spaces into categories. But categories are inherently problematic. Work and social, cultural and biological categories constitute the what of a person. The who of a person is constituted through their individual movement between and beyond these constituents. So there is within Arendt's work a distinct oscillation between people together for a common purpose and those speaking agents who in the process of this action reveal who they are. If we return to the question of where does knowledge reside from which the new can arise, it can be seen through the revelation of the self in speech and action. So we extend this understanding of this revelation to the appearance of what we term the educative agent. This is the becoming of the educative agent. So we're going to just shift just for a minute to talk a little bit about how Foucault informs our thinking. One of the things that we think Foucault and Arendt have in common is that they are both interested in the existence of a proper space, by which is meant a public realm in which to exercise the capacity to speak. So a proper space is one that is not determined by institutional constraint or imbued with elements of work. Foucault, in our reading of certain parts of his work, talks about the idea of obedience that dissuades our use of reason. And we see that as central to the circulation of authority and knowledge. So Foucault doesn't specifically speak in the part that we've been exploring about knowledge per se. He speaks of reason, arguing we are dissuaded from our own use of reason through obedience. We can't speak our knowledge often through our institutional positioning. We can only speak the knowledge of the institution. And I think from different parts of what people have said, there is that disconnect. When you're listening to yourself speak through that institutional positioning, and then you've got that other voice that's saying, really? You're really saying this? You know, because there's a discordance between, you know, what the institutional demand is of you and what else you're thinking about. So the implications for our theorisation of public pedagogy are twofold. Firstly, what constitutes the conditions for a sense of authority? Secondly, how can such an authority be recognised? I can see Jenny's put can you talk a little bit more about what can facilitate the capacity for new beginnings via speech and action? And a little bit further on, we're going to show...
One step ahead.
Yeah, you're one step ahead of us,
Always
Jenny.
one step ahead, many steps ahead of us.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's like watching,
That's good.
watching a TV show. Yeah, like what's going to happen next? So one of the things we're interested in is, you know, how we ended up collectively, we, Teo, you, me, people in general, feeling like we are lacking in authority. And to help us understand this, we've turned to Freudian psychoanalysis, because in psychoanalysis, there's an understanding that we internalize our relationship with others. And this is no less the case regarding our experience with authority. To use the word affect is to indicate our emotional encounter with what has been internalised and subsequently become a part of who we are. In the instance of authority, this can mean we have no sense of being able to act because we simply fear we have no agency from which to do so. And that's the effect of that internalisation. Yeah. So I've got up here on the slide that communities, and this is something that's come up in our work, often doubt their knowledge, specifically those that have been read as deficit. And as we've thought about, for a while now, when we think about the idea of obedience, communities are encouraged to deny their own knowledge. Resistance in engaging knowledges and subsequent authority actually held by individuals or communities is indicative of the damage caused by the wholesale negation by institutions and its use of knowledge as power. So for the purpose of theorising public pedagogy, the implications of a subject who has recast or re-educated the self relative to these authorities is able to enact a mode of being that is self-authorised. And we argue that in order to enact this mode of self-authorisation, the public realm must exist and be attuned to this occurrence. So in this instance, we see the knowledge of and within place when this actualisation is able to occur. So what we want to do now, so we want to show a video that captures, I've talked previously in the session about the knowledge, the signature project of the Public Pedagogies Institute as being the knowledge project in the pop-up school and going into geographically bounded spaces. So in Australia, we say a suburb, and in the Northern Hemisphere or in America, you say a neighbourhood. So going into a neighbourhood or a suburb and talking to people about what they consider to be significant knowledge within that bounded geographical space. And from those conversations that occur over many months, we ask people, would they be interested in participating or contributing to a learning and teaching event where they teach other people something of the knowledge that they have. And we call it a pop-up school. And it's definitely not from their discipline. That's right.
I'm Jennifer Tran. I'm the Footscray Pop-Up School event coordinator. I've organised this event to bring people from Footscray to celebrate in their learnings and teachings. We currently have, say, the knitting group ladies who are sharing a skill set. So they are from the local area and they get together every Wednesday at Footscray Library to learn knitting and do different craft workshops. So they're sharing their skills at this event. We also got some skateboard workshops, which is like about people learning coordination, skills that you don't actually learn inside a school. We've got a group called the Benchmark Crew, which are South Sudanese men who actually are from the area. They usually hang out in Madden Square where the event is organised. So they came together to perform a music song that speaks of their story. So that's what the Footscray Pop-Up School is about. It's about people from Footscray telling their story, telling their history, and also sharing their knowledge and teaching about their culture through, whether it's like through music, through dance, through storytelling. So that's about public pedagogy. It's like learning in public space.
The Public Pedagogies Institute is committed to learning and teaching outside of formal institutions. And this event really epitomises what the Institute is about. Everywhere you look today, you'll see exemplars of knowledge that is held in Footscray, the knowledge of Footscray. And that is really something that the Institute is committed to understanding, reflecting and representing. as time goes on and as the world as we know it progresses, it seems that knowledge is more and more located within the confines of the schooling system. But our aim or our remit or our vision is to take it out of that space and to recognise the fact that everybody who's here today, everybody who's in the broader geographical community of Footscray in this instance, has knowledge and teaches that knowledge and learns from other people. And that's part of, that is absolutely what we're wanting to celebrate, and that's what we want to focus on.
Oh, keep it going. Keep it going. Let's get it. Everybody clap your hands.
I created a kind of 6-7 week workshop where I recruited a bunch of 9 young people who were interested in creating something that we could share with the public. And what they came up with was a concept called vinyata, which is a Vietnamese take on the piñata, where we use the piñatas to, I guess, be a symbol where we can, where we attach the slogan that that represented a stereotype or a negative pressure or expectation that we had within our community, and also all the kind of stereotypes and racism that we experience from outside of our communities. So we invited the public to help us break through those barriers by symbolically, hitting the hitting the piñatas and helping us, to break that so that we can be who we want to be.
We've got a few kids learning to skateboard this afternoon, and it's what Rich and I do. We're own life, the journey of life. The skateboard's dance in between, so it's great to be a part of the community and get kids involved with skateboarding and working together, sharing the experience. I'm a local resident of Woolly Pond, but I do know Footscray well. When I first came to Australia, my first place of residence was the Midway Hostel. So I'm quite attached to the Footscray and the Maribyrnong area. What I was saying to Jen before was every little marquee that I visited today, I learned a thing or two about it, even with the Vietnamese culture and the way that these guys have put their program of activities together. I learned a few things as well. And I think that's really helpful because as a multicultural society, we should be and ought to be encouraged to provide these sorts of personal stories and connections a lot more, because that's how we come to understand each other and build greater cohesiveness in our society. And events like this should be happening a lot more at local level and encouraging people of different backgrounds, different age groups, different experiences to come together and share their learning, share their experience, and share their creativity. And that is, to me, really important, because if we can get understanding and appreciation at grassroots level, that's where our society becomes strong.
All right, so for us, that's a really strong and interesting example of people speaking on their own authority, representing their own knowledge base in a public space. And one of the ways in which, Foucault speaks about or describes this action of speaking on your own authority, speaking in this kind of situation. It's reflected in the pop-up school video, but also I think partly what people were talking about when they're talking about their nervousness of trusting their own sense of authority is this word parrhesia, which translates as truth-telling. And he writes of that as parrhesia only exists when there is freedom in the enunciation of the truth, freedom of the act by which the subject says the truth, and freedom also of the pact by which the speaking subject binds themselves to the statement and enunciation of the truth. To that extent, it's not the subject's social institutional status that we find at the heart of parrhesia, it is their courage. I love that quote. So this is not to suggest that there is an absolute truth or such a thing as the truth. Truth is an agent of political endeavour and therefore of ideological contestation. The important emphasis for Foucault is that the speaking subject in this instance is not performative relative to the institutional position. The enunciation occurs outside of this. So when we see the young people breaking the pinatas, which they call vignadas, each of the vignadas has language or words attached to it that are generalizations or stereotypes about being Australian Vietnamese. Standing up to those words or those social categorizations would be, in Foucault's reading, an act of parrhesia, breaking with the ways in which identity is being formed through broader societal and institutional understandings. So parrhesia or truth teller breaks with institutional codes, implicit or explicit, and opens up a field of possibility and danger. This attribute or way of being can be seen in what we are calling the educative agent. Explicit in the concept of the educative agent is the actualization of authority, and it is this actualization that is akin to parrhesia. This possibility of authority and subsequent knowledge is a challenge to power that purports to be the authority. Okay, so we're wanting to just, we're mindful of time, but we're keen to get people back into a breakout room, wanting you to think about times when you have witnessed or you have enacted speaking in a way that there's been an effort to silence you, or you understand that what you're speaking or what you've witnessed being spoken is coming into conflict with the institution as power. And the example I always think about is a few years ago, I listened to a man who, on the news, who was a farmer who was standing by a river, and he was getting more and more upset because the institution of the Bureau of Meteorology had done a whole lot of modelling around rainfall, the river's capacity, and he was standing up to that and saying, yes, I know all about what the Bureau of Meteorology has said about this river, but I'm here. I'm looking at the river. I've lived near this river all of my life. And so I have knowledge about this river. So that's the kind of, I guess, conflict or juxtaposition I'm interested in you going into breakout rooms and seeing if you might have been this person attempting to act on your own authority, speak your knowledge, or you might have an example where you've witnessed that occurring. So we've got about 10 minutes to do this, and so I'll ask Robin to quickly put you back into your breakout rooms. So can I get a sense of what people spoke about relative to thinking about a moment in time, whether it was yourself or you witnessed somebody speaking on their own authority? You were silenced.
Can I make a start?
Sure.
So we were talking about that issue, and I started telling my colleagues that I have quite a few experiences from the last few weeks and months. When I think of the North Melbourne towers who were silenced and locked in, I remember people saying, "We are not that. We feel negatively characterized by the government, that we are the ones who are basically troublemakers by living there without having the choice." And I argue that when I think of socialization, that governments are teachers and they teach us things we don't like, at least I don't like.
Wow.
So Peter, perhaps for the people who are from outside of Victoria, do you want to just explain that context?
Yeah, I can. So a few months ago, when the hard lockdown occurred, the Victorian state government said, because they noticed that there were quite a few infections in certain areas, and in particular in some public housing estates, they locked down these high-rise buildings within hours. People didn't have the opportunity to get food and to get things they really needed. They were locked in like prisoners.
They sent in the police force, actually,
yeah.
Without kind of too much notice. It was like police hanging out on every level at the doorways. It was terrible.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's a really great example. That's right. So, and there was limited, in fact, you could probably say no capacity for people to speak their own knowledge or authority to the powers that be in that instance. That's a great example. Thank you. Somebody else? Another group?
I'll go for our group. We had 3 different examples of 3 different kinds of authorities. One example was when the government was the authority, I think, right? Janet shared a story about the Royal Commission. Is that part of the government?
Yeah.
Right, so that's what I thought. So the Royal Commission around aged care, and she has personal experience, years working in that system. So she wrote to the Royal Commission basically saying, whatever y'all are doing, you don't understand. I have experience with what's happening. And she actually wrote letters, lawyers contacted her. They wanted to know like what evidence she had. And she started or helped start a not-for-profit organization for care workers to help improve the standards of care based on the ground, what do elderly need, not what bureaucrats think they need. So that was a really powerful and interesting example based on people going against the authority of the state. And then there was an authority of a school as an institution. And EO shared a story of being in a public and charter school systems, but a particular charter school where they were doing really harsh, punitive, police-like disciplining of students. It was hurting students, especially students of color, and putting teachers in terrible positions that had good relationships with students. Those relationships were being tested. So he and other teachers came together to basically call out this punishment that was harsh and unfair. They went on strike. They were able to, they basically caused these giant meetings to come together where they were going against the authorities of their school systems, their principals, their administrators, and talking to parents and students about challenging these policies. And they ended up all getting fired, the people that were in charge of, or the teachers that came together to fight those harsh policies. And then I just shared a brief example, not from my own life, but from my reading of Miles Horton's work with the Highlander Institute, and in the Appalachia region of the southern United States, the authority of corporations, mining companies, chemical plants that would dump chemicals into the waterways and tell everyone, we have the authority to say that none of this is harmful. And the people who lived in these spaces, places were saying, actually, you know, this is harmful. All of our relatives are getting sick and getting cancer, and we are going to go and do our actual research from our own personal lives, but also we're going to go into archives, we're going to go to medical journals, and we're going to find out exactly what these chemicals are and exactly what kind of harm they cause. And then they brought lawsuits to try to get these chemical companies to provide some sort of resources for causing all that harm, and also to try to change the laws to try to make better environmental protections. So
wow,
those are our examples.
Frightening.
Yeah, frightening, but yes, they're all great examples. Okay, somebody else? Another group?
I can have a go.
Yeah.
The authority of a hospital was one situation where a parent had died, and so both sisters questioning the hospital and just not believed their experience of, you know, their father dying. And this occurred over 4 weeks and then a follow-up year in a very traumatic sort of situation where, they're not heard, not believed. Questions like, well, why don't you trust the doctors in terms of their father's death? And another example was with international students in the university, and a very successful program got axed with, you know, smoke screens like, for example, you know, you're building the relationships to the students are too close. And it supported international students and very successfully, but no longer exists. So again, the questioning of that was not listened to and not heard by the institution. And for both those groups, it's interesting, the vulnerable, marginal participants in that, in relation to that, and also Erin's experience in the United States with COVID was that in the program they have to, part of their field work is to go into clinical sites, and from her experiences as an educator, she said instead of the students going through all that stress and having to be tested, that they could have similar learning in a controlled lab environment. So yeah, and I think all of those situations where you know, people, the women involved in asking the questions, very emotional and you know, hard to sort of give voice assertively at times because of that sort of pushback.
Thanks, Jan. I'm aware that we've only got about 4 minutes to go, and I'd encourage people who didn't get an opportunity to feed back or have other ideas. That's one of the reasons why we put up the Slack channel, which you hopefully got invited to. If not, please send me an email and I'll make sure you have access to it to continue the conversation. But just by way of finishing, and just listening to what people said, it really strikes me that not only is it outrageous, sad, all of the other words that we can use to describe the examples that people have given, but also what a loss it is to the institutions who can't hear other voices, okay, can't contend with ideas and ways of being that would, of course, challenge the way that they are, but ultimately reinvigorate them and reposition them to be more attentive to the people who are within them and make up the very thing that's called the institution. So this is our last slide, our way of finishing. So Our term educative agent specifically addresses authority. We argue public pedagogy is the actualisation of the educative agent as authority in the public. In this reading, the educative agent is the public pedagogue. The educative agent speaks or acts in the space new knowledge appears, and they speak, act on the authority of themselves, and thus enacts paresia. This is also a manifestation of the reauthorization of the self. This becoming pedagogue occurs as the one speaks or acts, the one appears, and the space for freedom is created, in this the becoming of the educative agent. When pedagogy encounters public, what comes into being is the educative agent and the presence of authority. And that's the end. So thanks, everyone. I hope you found it interesting. We've certainly found it interesting thinking about it.
And we would wonder, suggest when you, following from here, we haven't got time to do this, but we were going to ask you to consider what knowledge you would speak, which does not come from your discipline or from your institutional knowledge. So for me, it would be not my knowledge that I speak that is not about education, for example. What knowledge would I speak on my own authority, or would I act on my own authority? Anyway, it's something to think about.
Yeah.
I find it, that would require of me some risk taking. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks a lot, Robin, for chairing.